This is episode 1 of Test-Driven RSpec, a simple series on how to test drive Ruby code with RSpec. I'm Brett, and let's get to it. So, just a quick note about the setup. I'm using iTerm 2. You can use whatever terminal or command line interface you want to use. I'm using Ruby 2.3.1. You probably want to be using a modern Ruby. Anything 2.0 or better should do. This is more just to show things. You don't have to follow along. I'm using RSpec version 3.5.0. Version of RSpec, just within the 3 series or anything newer should apply and work. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be test driving out a simple class called dog. And this dog is going to have a few actions and a few methods to help us know the status of the dog. So the first thing we're going to do is create a spec for the dog called dogspec.rb. And we need to require RSpec, or else RSpec won't be loaded to work. And we're going to describe the class. So dog, and this is the first point where we've written the test. We haven't actually written test expectation, but we do have the test and we can run it. So we're going to try to run it. I'm going to run the test by running bundle exec RSpec path to dogspec, and we see that it fails. And this is the first step of test-driven development, right? We have a failing test, and now we're going to try to make it pass. Even though there's not a test, the code isn't going to work yet, so it's good to start early and start often. What we have is an uninitialized constant named dog, and what that means is we don't have the dog class. So we're going to define the dog class in dog.rb, class dog. Whoa, that was a Vim mess up, sorry about that. Class dog. And we save it. Now if we go back to the dog spec, run the tests again, we still have the same issue. Now that is because dog spec doesn't know about dog. It doesn't have that Ruby code loaded, so we need to require it. So by using require relative, we can just do require relative dog, run the tests again. Great, it runs, which is important. There are no test examples though, so there's no tests to run, so it doesn't run anything, but we know that it's working. We know that RSpec and the class that's under test is loaded, so that's a great first step. The first method we're going to test drive for dog is a method called bark, and bark returns a string, and that's where we're going to start. So we're going to describe bark. When describing methods, I use describe, and then I use a pound sign for the method name if it's an instance method. If it's something like dot new dog with collar, that's kind of silly because I don't know what that would be, but if it was a class method where you actually call it as dog, new dog with collar, then I use a period instead of a hash mark, but that's just a little side. And for dog, we're going to write the example of it returns the string woof. It probably doesn't even need to be a string. It can just, we know it's a string because it's in quotes. So what we're going to do is we're going to do create a dog. So do dog equals dog.new, and then we'll expect the dog when it barks to equal woof. Great. Now if I run the tests again, it fails. It fails because we don't have the method bark in dog. And this seems really simple, right? It seems kind of contrived and just a little like, oh, no duh. Of course we have to, create the method. But this little simple feedback loop works really well. And the best way I've found that works for me when learning it and sharing it is you start really small, right? With just a simple method that returns a string. And then from there, as it gets more complex, you have this groundwork and this mental approach and feedback loop of how to approach test-driven development, which I really like and has really helped me a lot. So I just ran the tests again after defining bark. It fails because we expected woof, but we got nil. So why is that? Well, it doesn't actually return anything. So now if we add woof, run the tests again, the tests pass. So we have our first passing test, which is that's a great start. We have a method bark. We have the test for bark. And let's see if there's a few things we can do to improve this. So once you have the code written and the test written, it's really good to go back and make sure that the test code and the actual code and the method make as much sense as possible and are quality, well-written code. So there's a few things I see here that we can change. The first is that RSpec defines automatically this subject, and subject is equivalent to doing dog.new. It instantializes the constant under test and lets you, just reference it with subject. So we could do subject.bark instead of dog. Subject is nice because it's a generic name. If the class name were to change, if it were pulled into a shared example group in RSpec, which lets you share your test examples, it would be nice and non-specific, which is what we want here. Run the test again, it passes. And like I said, RSpec actually defines this already, so we can delete it and run the test again. And there we go. One less line of code and easier to maintain and change and adjust in the future. So we have subject and we can just call subject.bark. The next thing we're going to describe is a method called hungry. This is going to be a method that returns Boolean true or false, dependent on whether or not the dog is hungry. So it returns true if the dog... So the dog, we're going to actually implement something new with this called hunger level. It's going to drive this out with the test. So it returns true if hunger level is more than 5. And we'll create a new dog. We call this hungry dog. And it's a dog.new. And it has a hunger level of 7. So we have our hungry dog, and we're going to expect hungry dog, hungry to equal true. Whoa. So that's just a simple test expectation. It fails because we have the wrong number of arguments because we introduced this new hunger level. Maybe there's, in a real world example, there's probably another way that this would be driven out, but for us, I just know that's something we need. We need to be able to define whether or not the dog's hungry when we create it. We expected it to not have any there's no initializer, so we don't expect any parameters. So we're going to define the initializer, and we're going to create the hunger level parameter. I'm using a keyed parameter so that it's really explicit when you're initializing the dog what you're passing in, which is a really nice feature in Ruby like version 2 or version 2.1, which has been a big help. And we're going to set it to no default value for now, save it, run the tests again, try to get the test failure message changing or passing. And now we have 2 failures, which is less than ideal. We have the initial test we wrote for Woof failing because it's expecting initialized hunger level to be passed in. And why that is because by putting this colon here for the name parameter, we're requiring it. So we can actually set a default value. We'll just set it to 0 of a new dog. So if you do dog.new, it defaults to having a hunger level of 0. So now if we run the test again, great. The other test that we had before passing is still passing. And this one is now failing for a new reason, which is hungry is not a defined method. So just like we defined bark, we're going to define hungry. Save that, run the tests again to make the smallest change we can make, and it says we expected true and got nil. So, what's the simplest thing we can do to make that pass? Well, we could just return true, which, feels a little cheap, but it's all in service of driving this out. So, all the tests are passing, which is good, but hungry doesn't have any actual implementation, right? It's just hard-coded to true. So in order to drive that out, we do it returns false. We want to do the inverse of it. If hunger level is 5 or less. We'll take a dog. We'll set its hunger level to 5, which I like to do because it's the tipping point. And we know that if it's 5 or less, then it'll return false. And that's great. Run the tests again. It fails. So now we can actually write our first bit of non-hard-coded return value, which is going to be hunger level greater than 5. Delete the true. Run the tests again. And it fails again because undefined method greater than for hunger level. And that's because we actually didn't set hunger level yet. So we've got to set it up here in the initializer to the passed in hunger level value, to the instance variable of at hunger level. And great, now all the tests are passing. So we drove out this simple hungry method. We have a API for setting the dog's hunger level when it initializes, and we're able to check against it. Now I just want to take a quick break and say, how can we improve these tests? Well, for the expectations in RSpec, you can actually do expect hungry dog to be 2, and you can do _b, and then if the method ends in a question mark, you can actually just do be hungry, because RSpec infers that it's Boolean. So we can run the tests again, just a little cleaner. We can do that again here. So this would actually be non-hungry dog. We're going to address that name anyways because it's kind of weird, but we're going to expect non-hungry dog to not be hungry. So that's just a nice little way to write the RSpec expectations for Boolean return values a little cleaner. Other little changes we can make. I don't like these specific hungry or non-hungry names. It's confusing and it makes it weird to refactor. So we'll just keep it a dog. Run the tests again, make sure it passes. So with every change I save and I test it, just really quick feedback loop, make sure I didn't break anything. The next change I'm going to make is instead of using dog as a constant, you can actually do described class. And what this does is it grabs the constant that's being described, and this should be RSpec.described. Sorry about that. Describe works because of, I want to say magic, but there's a real reason why not having RSpec works, but you want to do RSpec.describe and call this block with RSpec. That's the side. So we have dog, and describe class actually uses dog. So now if we run the tests again, it passes. And if we were to ever change this class name here, we wouldn't have to change it throughout the rest of it, right? It would just use the describe class. And this is really nice for refactoring, and it's also really nice for pooling examples into shared example groups and including them in different classes. So it's just like a really clean way of initializing an instance of the class that's under test. Really big fan of using describe class. Other little changes is I like contexts a lot in RSpec. For this example, it's kind of simple and maybe unnecessary, but I still like to do it. It's good practice. And context, so whenever you see an if in your in your example, usually that says, oh, okay, we should create a context. And a context is basically, how I view it, is a different path through the code. For hungry, there's 2 paths. Is a dog hungry, is a dog not hungry. If you have a if, an if else, and an else, there's 3 paths. So a context, you create a context for each different path through the code for that method that's under test, which is really helpful for organizing and reading the test output. So for example, for this it would be when hunger level is more than 5, it returns true. So now we have a simple expectation here, which is just shorter and easier to maintain and change. And we do the same here. So we'll do when hunger level is 5 or less, pull it out into a context. That's all good. Run the test, it all passes. And then, similar to how I showed subject before, you can create a subject for any block within this. So like, we could create a specific one for hungry or for each context. And that's where I find it really useful, is within each context. So now we say subject describe class.new, and we get rid of dog, and we just keep it a generic name in case, whatever changes, or, we ever want to change the name or whatever. Just keeps it simple. Follows the conventions of bark too, so we know subject is dog because we're working within the dog class test. And for here, do the same thing. We can't use the assignment operator like before because it's outside of the example, so we use a block, and that's how the value gets assigned. And yeah, this becomes subject. Run it again. Test passed, so that's fantastic. And that's a nice little example of using the test-driven development with context to drive out these methods. And now we're going to build one last thing, which is a feed method. It's going to be an action called feed, And we're gonna say when we feed the dog, it is no longer hungry. So we do expect, we'll do subject. We don't have a subject yet, but we could define one as, the hungry dog. And we could say expect, well, we're gonna feed the dog, so we'll feed it, and then we'll say expect subject to not be hungry. Run the tests. It fails because we don't have the method feed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the method feed. Run the tests again. We see the error is to not be hungry, but the dog is actually still hungry, and that's because we didn't reset the hunger level. So we'll set it to 0, run the tests again, and there we go. We have a passing test for feed, and that's like a simple little loop for that. And we could actually do another thing when the dog is hungry. The dog is no longer hungry. So context, when the dog is hungry, we have a subject that is hungry. It is no longer hungry after being fed. So we have feed, dog is hungry. And there we go. There's a simple class tested with RSpec using test-driven development. The next episode of this will expand upon this a little more and just keep continuing with the dog and introducing animal as a parent class and a cat as a subclass, and using shared example groups and driving out how those two classes could possibly interact. Thank you.